Hello, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of Roma, Alfonso Cuaron's 2018 film that gets into a lot of interesting Mexican history and is also just a great movie in its own right. So assuming you've already listened to part 1 and we've been introduced to our main character, Cleo, who works as a housekeeper for a relatively well-off family in Mexico City. The father of that family has now left, and the father of Cleo's unborn baby has also left. So that's where we're at in the next section of the movie, which has the family visiting the hacienda of a wealthy landowning friend. We are thrown right into some Mexican history here that we should all be aware of if we've been listening to the series I did on the Mexican Dirty War. Cleo is shown to her rooms by one of the indigenous housekeepers in the hacienda, and the heads of the family dogs through the years are mounted on a certain wall, and Cleo pauses to take a look at the heads of the dogs. Her friend points out one dog from 1911, a sure nod to the Mexican Revolution of 1910, which was fought in large measure for land reform and local democracy. The friend points out that the latest dog may have been poisoned by villagers who are upset over the land that the Don has assumed control over. As we know from Mexican history during this period of time, it was rife with capital being infused into the countryside and large landholding interest privatizing land, swallowing up communal peasant land. And this is a huge instigator of violence and guerrilla activity in many rural areas of Mexico. Some of the friends at the party jokingly make reference to having their hacienda expropriated by guerrillas, but they may not be laughing for long. And sadly, just as an aside, it's referenced later in the film that Cleo's mom, her land is taken over by the government and these large landholding interests. Like many during this time period, Cleo is expressing helplessness and confusion over the situation. One of the many reasons that some at this time could and did turn to guerrilla and leftist groups, as we discussed in our podcast series on the Mexican Dirty War. Now, in the last episode, we referenced the earthquake that happens at the hospital, and we speculated about what it might mean and what the symbolism behind it might be. To me, one of the things, again, that makes this movie incredible is there is this ominous tone that is building throughout the film, this feeling that something terrible is going to happen. Maybe it starts with Furman leaving Cleo. Maybe it starts before that, but by the time we get to the earthquake and the family visiting the hacienda, there's definitely this feeling that something bad's going to happen. You have the creepy dog heads on the wall carrying the ghosts of Mexican history, the references to guerrilla violence, the people casually firing, shooting guns and handling weapons unsafely around children, the super long staircase with no handhold that makes you worry a pregnant Cleo might fall, the fire that breaks out in the forest. This ominous tone is building, and it feels like it could explode at any moment, which is obviously a big builder of unseen conflict and tension throughout the movie. And just as another sort of side note on the movie, I think the scenes at the hacienda also help to show just how beautifully this movie is shot. Some of the scenes are absolutely incredible to watch. Even in the black and white, you can really feel the atmosphere. Especially beautiful are the long shots where the camera follows Cleo across long stretches of Mexico City, usually in one take. It's camera work like this that really makes you appreciate the feel of the city and the recreations and the rebuilding of the sets from the time period with incredible attention to detail. And as Alfonso Cuaron mentions when he talks about the movie, it's more about creating a feel from memory than describing and executing a game plan, so to speak. And on that note, as we said in the last episode, much of this movie depicts scenes from Alfonso Cuaron's real life, including his father abandoning the family. In the extra features, he says that he wanted to understand the motivations and the suffocations that his father was feeling in order to make the movie. So Cuaron wasn't excusing him or his behavior, but he was trying to get in his head in order to make a film. You can imagine that would have been difficult for him to do, but it's fascinating to think about. And it's no surprise that Cuaron also says in those extra features that cinema and loneliness go hand in hand. And you can really feel the themes of loneliness and isolation and what it means to belong shining through as the story of the movie progresses. And in a sort of yin and yang way, much of the movie does have this very personal feel and atmosphere. But I also like how, on the other side of the coin, the movie makes sure that every scene, every second of dialogue is always taking place in the context of something bigger, just like real history. The context of the film plays a huge role. There are no close-ups of dialogue where it's just two characters speaking together and the camera is super focused on them. Every conversation, every action is happening in connection to the rest of the world at all times. Whether it's larger family dynamics, the student protests that we're about to get to, election campaigns, haciendas and land reform, it's all connected. It's all connected to history, and it's an interesting way to make a film. Anyways, after the hacienda, we are back in the city now, and as Cleo is taking the kids for a night on the town, they see the kid's dad, Antonio, hand in hand with a younger girl, both looking pretty drunk, seemingly having a great time as they run out of the shot. And so there you have one mystery of the film solved. Doesn't seem like there really was much of a research project in Quebec after all. But perhaps it's this sighting of the cheating and disappeared Antonio that inspires Cleo to go look for Furman. So she heads out to the countryside to try to find him. Cleo treks through a pretty rundown rural area that is devoid of infrastructure and some of the base necessities of life. Interestingly, there's a campaign event for President Luis Echeverria Alvarez of the PRI, and that campaign event is going on in the background of the scene, and the president is promising fresh water and infrastructure to the people of places like this. And as we know from our study of the Dirty War in our previous episodes of this podcast series, there was a bit of this propaganda campaign for the hearts and minds of people in rural Mexico. Many people were unhappy with the lack of land reform, the lack of real democratic transparency, and as people are turning to these guerrilla and leftist groups, the PRI is trying to paint them as the bad guy and themselves as the good guys who are bringing modernity and infrastructure and economic booming to these rural areas. Obviously, the extent to which that actually happened is certainly up for debate, but at any rate, Cleo finally finds Furman at the Los Halcones training session that we referenced earlier in the film. The Mexican government, in collaboration with the CIA, had been training paramilitary groups like this one for use against what they perceived as leftist guerrilla groups, or really any group that was working against state interests. And we know from our United States history that the CIA was involved in a lot of operations like this. And one of the leaders of the Halcones training session outlines his philosophy of the mind only being useful as a means to supply strength to the physical body. It's this notion of discipline in air quotes there, and strength and violence being valued above other qualities that is going to contribute to disaffected young men like Furman joining these groups and eventually being used to perpetrate state terror. And sure enough, sadly, Cleo confronting Furman goes about as well as we could have expected, with Furman making threats and using intimidation of violence to ensure that he plays no role in raising Cleo's child. Later in the movie, a drunken Sophia comes home, driving the car into a wall yet again, and she puts words to this feeling and really theme of the film perfectly, saying to Cleo, quote, "We are alone. No matter what they tell you, we women are always alone," end quote. All of this brings us to the 1971 Corpus Christi Massacre, one of the biggest events in Mexican history, and it's depicted in the movie with appropriate horror and shock. Cleo and Grandma are heading into the city to look for a crib for her soon-to-be-born child, but they are walking right through the student protest. Students in Mexico City are protesting the educational conditions throughout Mexico. They're protesting against the PRI, who increasingly have become authoritarian during this time period. They want a more democratic process. But this peaceful protest ends in a massacre. As riot police block off the exits, Furman's Los Halcones paramilitary group attack the protesters with bamboo sticks and rifles, killing 120 people, injuring countless others. It's depicted in the movie, and it's a real event in Mexican history that carries shockwaves even to this day. In the film, a man is murdered right in front of Cleo. Furman appears with gun in hand, pointing it at the mother of his child, and seemingly debating whether or not to pull the trigger. He doesn't, but the chaos and the trauma of the event causes Cleo's water to break. She needs to get to the hospital, and traveling through the death and violence of the massacre, in order to get there, she gets stuck in traffic. Something is obviously wrong, and Cleo gets to the hospital late. Obviously, the scene in the hospital is absolutely heartbreaking. It may be worth pointing out, I think, that none of the actors in the scene knew the story or plot or actions of any of the other characters in the scene. Even the doctors were real doctors. They weren't actually actors. So when Cleo is attempting to give birth here, the actress who played Cleo was expecting to give birth to a baby, and her shock and surprise and devastation at what happens is all the more real. Cleo is, of course, devastated by what happens, and it's incredibly hard to watch. It's such a tough scene emotionally anyway, and the fact that the actress playing Cleo is really displaying those emotions because she wasn't expecting that to happen. In the extras to the film, you can actually see Alfonso Cuaron come in at the end of that scene and give her a hug and kind of check on her to see if she's okay. It's that type of scene, brutal and traumatic, heartbreaking stuff. I won't go into too many details here. You have to watch it yourself, but Cleo's child doesn't make it. Towards the end of the film now, a traumatized and recovering Cleo gets invited to a vacation to the beach with the family. We learn that Cleo can't swim, so Chekhov's gun has been loaded for the climax of the film. But before that, there's an incredible scene, one of my favorites in the movie. Sophia finally tells the kids that Antonio has left them and they're getting a divorce. There's this big cathartic moment where the kids are upset about it, but Sophia tells them it will be a new adventure and they can still be a family and Cleo will still be there. And now they're going to go get some ice cream. And the family is all sitting on this bench together, except for Cleo, who's standing a little bit aside from the bench because there's no room. There's no dialogue here, but just that shot of Cleo standing while the family is sitting is basically summarizing the themes of the movie as a whole. They love each other, and they are a family, but there is still that invisible barrier there. And for Cleo, there is that sense, that feeling of being on the inside, but really being on the outside because of race or class or identity or background or past trauma. And it's the perfect scene to put before the climax where the kids are drowning in the water at the beach. Because it's a reminder that Cleo, by rights, shouldn't have to feel obligated to save the kids. She has been called a servant, been subjected to state violence and terror, been judged and demeaned on account of her race, been relegated to second-class housekeeper because of who she is and how she was born. Her family's land and wealth has been taken away over the course of generations. She lost her child and was abandoned by her father. She has no obligation to risk her life to save this family. And yet she does, simply because she loves them. It's an amazing scene, and it's a powerful demonstration of love. After dragging the kids out of the waves, Cleo confesses that she didn't want her child to be born. Maybe because she would grow up in the same hopeless conditions that Cleo herself grew up in and experienced. But again, this makes her sacrifice and demonstration of love to save those kids all the more special and meaningful. Fittingly, the movie ends with Cleo climbing the stairs into the sky as a plane flies by overhead.